Okay, let's get started. Just going to have to be admitting people for a bit. All right. Okay. That's that. Okay. All right. Let's admit that person. No. Right. So today we're turning to discussing an extremely influential sociological theory of race. Um, on the principle that we are exploring various accounts of race that involve deference to the sciences. We've just spent some time looking at what deference to biology might require. And so now we're turning to thinking about what deference to a social science might require. And in this case, it's sociology and to an influential account of race in recent sociology by Michael Omi and Howard Wynant. In the course of developing their account, they um, refer to much of the history that we've already discussed, but they do so for the purpose of proposing a sociological theory of race. And they frame the question of what they call racial formation against the background of the idea that as social beings, we must categorize people so as to be able to navigate in the world, to discern quickly who may be friend or foe, to position and situate ourselves within prevailing social hierarchies, and to provide clues that guide our social interactions with the individuals and groups we encounter. That's why they say we have so many ways of othering people, defining other human beings as other, along the lines of gender, class, sexuality, religion, culture, language, nationality, and age, among other perceived distinctions. And as they also point out, while the act of categorizing people and assigning different attributes to such categories may be universal, the categories themselves are subject to enormous variation over historical time and space. Now, Omi and Wynant are going to offer a theory of racial formation, an account of how races come to be socially. And because they're sociologists, they're going to do so in a way that focuses on the social processes by which the meaning of the category of race, like the meanings of gender, class, sexuality, religion, culture, language, nationality, and age, are produced through social negotiation, even through social conflict and contest. So they're particularly interested, as modern sociologists often are, in how people who have social power interact with people who have less power to produce the resulting social understandings. So, as they put it, the definitions of specific categories are framed and contested from above and from below. The social identities of marginalized and subordinate groups, for example, are both imposed from above by dominant social groups and/or state institutions, and constituted from below by these groups themselves as expressions of self-identification and resistance to dominant forms of categorization. In any given historical moment, they say, one can understand a social category's prevailing meaning, but such understandings can also be erroneous or transitory, shifting. And now here's another important point. these meanings or understandings are often no more than the unstable and tentative result of the dynamic engagement between elite and street, between above and below, definitions and meanings. Now, notice that the conflict between those above, those with power, and those below, who are relatively less powerful, is seen to produce a meaning shared between them that is the result of that conflict. Now, you might have thought that you could instead have proposed that terms have different meanings for the powerful and the powerless, so that they don't have a shared understanding at all. So there might have been different conceptions of race, for example, not as a matter of individual variation, but varying as a matter of social identity, so that different social groups had different ideas, different conceptions, as I called them, of the concept of race. And I think one reason why a sociologist might think this second approach, which focuses on different conceptions, might be less helpful, is because of an important social fact. People with different amounts of power do, in fact, use the same language, and they do engage in interactions with one another in which they have a shared sense, not just of the meaning of the words they utter, but of the things that they're doing. And to get a sense of the sort of thing that I have in mind, I put a link in the on Brightspace under videos to a short video from an organization called Facing History on the Jim Crow South in the United States. So it's under Jim Crow from GHAO. So it'd be FHAO, Facing History and Ourselves. And their point is that, for example, in the South, in the early 20th century, in many places in the South, when a black person stepped off the sidewalk to let a white person pass in the Jim Crow South, that interaction depended on a shared set of expectations about how each of them would behave. It happened automatically, routinely, without much reflective thought, in much the way that language works routinely without reflective thought, because speaker and hearer are in some sense governed by shared understandings. And so those of you who don't have much knowledge about that period in the American history can, as I say, look at the video in the video section of Brightspace to see the sort of thing that was involved in the racial understandings that constituted the practice of what's called Jim Crow. And just remember, if you have a question or something, just raise your hand. I'm hoping I'll see it. I'm not quite sure whether I'm not sure whether I've set this up, my screen up properly, but if you have a question and you raise your hand and I don't see it, just unmute yourself and speak up. So don't worry about doing that. If I say anything that needs explanation, just more explanation, just pipe up. Don't worry about interrupting if you need to. So there is, according to Omi and Wynant, some shared understanding of what racial categories mean in any particular social group, any society, which is shared between the powerful and the powerless, and in which, and in particular, between people of dominant and subordinated racial groups. So Omi and Wynant assume, as we have not, that race is in some sense a social construction. Remember, we've been exploring the possibility that it's a biological phenomenon, which is it's not a racial construction. And we'll go into more detail in the weeks ahead as to what it might mean to say that something is a social construction. But their approach is offered as one that takes this social constructiveness for granted. So we can see some of what this means in their work. So the first important sociological claim they make then is not the claim that race is socially constructed, that, as I say, they assume most sociological approaches will agree with. That's not one of the things that's in debate. But rather, their distinctive claim is that it is what they call a master category. And in order to understand what they do and don't mean by this, it will help to have available a concept that they don't use, namely that of intersectionality. This is an account of the ways in which each person's racial identities, for example, are inflected by other social identities, gender, sexuality, religion, age, and the like. And that's the reason that Kimberly Crenshaw, an American feminist legal theorist and civil rights activist, that's the reason she coined the word intersectionality, because she wanted to underline how our many identities intersect to produce effects that are not simply the sum of them, in a way I'll now try to make clear. So, for example, being, say, a black lesbian in the United States is not a matter of simply combining three vectors, African American, female, and homosexual. Rather, how gay people think they should behave and how other people expect gay people to behave will change depending on what their race or gender is. So the treatment of people of one race and gender is not a matter of their having applied to them one after the other, so to speak. The treatment other people think appropriate for their race, then plus the treatment they think appropriate for their gender. Sexism in the Jim Crow South, for example, in the 1950s, kept middle-class white women at home and sent working-class black women to work for them. So there's a case where you couldn't say that being a woman kept you out of the labor market. If you were a black woman, it kept you in the labor market. It was only middle-class white women who were kept out of the labor market by sexism. So that's an example of intersectionality. And we'll return to this topic in a bit. But with that much said, we can take up the sense in which for Omi and Wynant, race is a master category. And let me repeat, since some people have joined since I last said this, if you have a question, I may not be able to see your raised hand. So simply unmute yourself and say, excuse me, or hello, or something, and I will be there. I don't want you to allow me to proceed without saying things that you don't think are clear. So what do they mean by saying that race is a master category? So they're not claiming that race explains the other categories. That would be to deny the significance of intersectionality and the reality of the fact that we have many identities and not just a racial identity. Rather, what they're saying is that the construction of race in colonial North America created categories of people, in the first instance, black and white and Indian, i.e. Native American, and that those categories then became, as they put it, the template of both difference and inequality. So other categories and other forms of inequality, that is, come to be modeled on or derived from race categories and racial inequality. Furthermore, they claim that this role of race as a template was a matter of conscious reflection on the part of those who shaped different regimes of domination and inequality and difference in the United States. So Omi and Wynant exemplify what they mean here by discussing gender and class. And to understand what they say about class, we must recognize that one central assumption of much sociological theory, going back to Marx's discussion of capitalism in his book Capital, is that your social class is fixed to some extent by your place in the system of production, whether as a manager, a worker, or an owner of capital, or as a professional who services this system as a teacher, lawyer, or health professional. That much said about class, we can see that Omi and Winant's claim that race is a master category is exemplified in their view that race has shaped the meaning of such concepts as work and worker, labor and employment, master and servant, supervisor and subordinate. So if that's true, then the social meanings of what it is to be a worker, white or black, depends on categories derived from the model of race, which in this case began as one in which black people were unpaid workers, subordinated not just to the people that the law said owned them, but also to white people, other white people. And one example of the sort of thing they have in mind is the fact that the category of white rural farm workers, whether or not they owned the farms on which they worked, were regarded by middle and upper class white people as rednecks because they worked in the sun and thus got their necks burned in the way in which black workers enslaved on plantations had traditionally done. So simply put, the lower status of the kind of manual labor that the so-called rednecks engaged in derived from its association with black people and the low status of the work of black people. So this portion of the white working class thus had the meaning of their class identity shaped by the template of race. Similarly, Omi and Winant argue, gender in the United States was shaped by this racial template. Here's what they say, the corporeal distinction, the bodily distinction between white men and the others over whom they ruled as patriarchs in the heterosexual nuclear family and masters in the system of the plantation links race to gender and people of color to women. Whether they were identified by their racial status as enslaved or free, black, Indian, mestizo, or by the patriarchal family as daughters, wives, or mothers, they were corporeally stigmatized, permanently rendered as other than, and the possessions of, the white men who ruled. So again, there's a connection between they're arguing, between the domination of women in the patriarchal family and the domination of black people under the system of enslavement. Now, for them, it's not just patterns of domination like this that are based on the racial template. Patterns of resistance are too. So, for example, the women's movement, the movement for women's suffrage, to get women the vote in the later 19th century into the 20th century and so on, took on some of the strategies of the movement for black civil rights. And the women's suffrage movement was formed on models that came for the struggle for black voting rights. Indeed, Frederick Douglass, there on the left, for example, one of the leading African-American rights activists of the later 19th century, who had, as you probably know, escaped enslavement before the Civil War and was a leading abolitionist. He was an important figure in the meeting in July of 1848 at the first Women's Rights Convention in Seneca Falls, New York, which is sometimes said to be the origins of the American women's rights movement. So these are some of the reasons why Omi and Winant say race is a fundamental organizing principle of social stratification. Not, in other words, just social stratification by race, but all forms of social stratification. It has influenced the definitions of rights and privileges, the distribution of resources, and the ideologies and practices of subordination and oppression. The concept of race as a marker of difference has permeated all forms of social relations, they say, and it's a template for the processes of marginalization that continue to shape social structures as well as individual and collective psyches. Okay. Do you think that Omi and Wynant make a good case for the claim that race is a master category in the United States? And here I'm going to assume that you will just unmute yourself, since I don't seem to be able to see any hands. Just unmute yourselves. You can raise your hand if you like, and I may see it, but but just speak up if I don't respond to you. I can see Luke Alonso, so maybe you should say something.
Yeah, I'm still kind of like wrapping my head around the concept of like a master category, but I mean it
Good.
definitely in the United States, I think race is definitely a very important category to consider, just given our like history. Probably more so than some other places, but yeah.
Okay. Yeah, and it is a claim about the United States that they're making.
Yeah, yeah.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Good. Juliana Franco.
Yeah, I'm a little skeptical about race being regarded as a master category, simply because the discrimination and kind of use of women as homemakers and kind of birthing cattle comes from largely before colonial times, I would say. Like, it wasn't uncommon in the medieval times for women to be sold off young and used for housework and expected to birth and raise as many children as possible. So while I do see the claim that race may have constructed other categories of inequality, maybe within the United States, I don't see how it could be a master category when these versions of inequality still existed outside of the United States prior to colonial slavery.
Good. So the claim that it's a master category is the claim that it has shaped all the others in a way that all the others haven't shaped it, right?
So it's not the idea that it created these categories,
No,
but
no, I
that they
don't
shaped
no,
them.
because then you would win your argument without any possibility of refutation,
Absolutely.
because concepts, of course, there were concepts of gender before. I mean, we're arguing that the race concept was developed at a certain point, and there were ideas about gender long before that race concept was. So you're absolutely right about that.
Okay.
Um, but the example that's meant to sort of suggest that there is a way in which gender in the United States has been inflected by race is the point about uh, the example I gave of, the way in which in the Jim Crow South, um, whether a woman was kept out of the um, marketplace, was meant to be at home as a homemaker, depended on whether she was white or black and whether she was middle class or working class, right?
And so this theory wouldn't apply to other states or other nations that had popularized slavery at the time, like the Spanish, for example. They wouldn't regard this as being a master category in Spain.
Um, Well, they're just making a claim about the United States, so
Okay.
they could look into the other cases and say, yeah, it looks like it's a master category in Brazil too, which is of course Portuguese, not Spanish speaking, or they could say, yeah, it's a master category in Spain as well, or not. But their only specific claim is that it's a master category in the United States.
Okay.
So then we could. I mean, I think you can see that there are going to be places where there's slavery, where race isn't doing any work at all. I mean, there was slavery in the country that I grew up in long before. Well, there was slavery independent of transatlantic slavery. I mean, that is to say, some of the people who were sold out of the Gold Coast into transatlantic slavery were people who'd already been enslaved in Africa, and they might have been the descendants of people who'd been enslaved in Africa. And there were systems of slavery, actually some of them associated with plantations in West Africa long before the British Empire or the French Empire or the Portuguese Empire incorporated them into their systems. And there, race wasn't a category, obviously, because everybody was what we would call black. Um, and similarly, there were forms of slavery in the Mediterranean and the Barbary coast, so the coast of Morocco, Tunisia, that area, um, which enslaved white people, enslaved Europeans. So again, in those places, slavery would have had a meaning, but race wouldn't have had a meaning. And in particular, race and slavery wouldn't have been connected. So it's a specific claim about the United States. And I mean, I think it's plausible in Brazil too, that what's plausible is that if race is a master category in the United States, then it's a master category in Brazil. Um, so, but that to argue that you have to think about how race works in Brazil, and we've already noticed that it works somewhat differently from the way it works in North America.
Interesting. Thank you.
Good. Thanks for raising that question. Elle.
Yeah, so I had a little bit of, or just something to say. I'm not really sure if this exactly feeds into race as a master category in the United States, but just from my experience with other groups that face discrimination and face oppression, I feel like I've heard a lot of people kind of use racism, especially African American racism, as kind of like a control example for discrimination. Um,
Good.
and kind of like an example, uh, like if someone were to say something and someone else were to say, "Oh, that's discriminatory against this group," imagine if you said something similar to a black person. Like that's something
Right.
that I've heard
Good.
a good amount. And I
Good.
feel like that's just kind of like because of the historical element of racial slavery in the United States, I feel like in other places, that might not be the exact same kind of thought process. But I feel like in America, especially just in the places in a modern context that I've been involved with, I feel like there's a lot of just influence on just like here, we all know, or like most of us in our head think of racism as like this bad, objectively bad thing. Um, so like it's kind of like used as like a middle ground on like oppression and that kind of thing.
Good. So you could say people are using it as a kind of model case, and I think
Yeah.
that would sort of fit with the idea. I'll say, I mean, another way. So we mentioned this. I just mentioned the example of the way that the fact that how gender is inflected in the United States. Gender is inflected by race. So I gave that example, race and class. So that white middle class white women were supposed to stay at home, and black women were supposed to work, and in particular work often for middle class white women. But we have other examples. So a lot of our stereotypes associated with other forms of discrimination, like homophobia, for example, are racially inflected. That is, stereotypes of gay black men and stereotypes of gay black, gay white men, and stereotypes of black lesbians and white lesbians may be different, right? The sort of, I think as it were, comes to mind when people are thinking about LGBT people depends on whether they're thinking of them as black or white. So that's another. And if that's true, then that would be a way in which race was operating as this kind of template thing, which is what they're saying. Okay.
All right.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you.
Good. Thank you. All right. So against the background of these ideas, Omi and Wynant introduce the theory of racial formation. That's their theory, right? The book is called Racial Formation in the United States. And they begin by defining it in this way. Racial formation is the socio-historical process by which racial identities are created, lived out, transformed, and destroyed. And this proposal, they then locate in an ongoing debate about whether or not race is real, that is objective and biological, or unreal. that is illusory and ideological. And we'll return to these ideas about race as ideology later. I'll just say right now that one classical understanding of ideology is not just a system of ideas, not just a system of ideas that imposes domination on some group, but a system of ideas that's in some way systematically illusory, systematically distorts reality in order to impose domination. We may or may not agree that that's true about racism, and so we may or may not agree that racism is ideological in that sense, and we will spend time discussing that later. But introducing the word ideology, I shouldn't do so without making it clear that this is a sort of technical term. It's not just not any old system of ideas. But we'll talk about that more later. So the fundamental thrust of what they're saying is this: whether or not racial categories correspond to some objective biological essence or some other system of categories grounded in natural facts, racial categorization has profound real effects in social life. So in that sense, at least, race or something like it is clearly real. Even if the biological theories are false, the fact is that in the name of those biological theories, people were treated differently. And so those ideas have a real social effect, a social effect that proceeds by way of classifying some people as black and some as white and some as Asian and some as Native American and so on. That has real effects whether or not the categories themselves are in some sense grounded in objective reality. So they think that it's more helpful to think of ideas about race not as a matter of defining a meaning for racial terms like black and white or African American, European American, Asian American, Caucasian, and so on, but as, and this is what they say, an unstable and decentered complex of social meanings constantly being transformed by political struggle. That's not on this page. I'll get to this page in a minute. The search for a single meaning for race is bound to be unsuccessful if the social meanings of racial categories are the site of constant political struggle, because searching for a meaning involves fixing something that is in fact constantly being contested. And it's perhaps worth observing here that not all the struggles over the meaning of race are in an obvious way political, even if you take political more broadly than just meaning having to do with the state. Spencer's debate with Mayer, which we just discussed, for example, is not obviously political. It's a debate about the meaning of race, but it's not an obviously political one. But they have an answer to the question why they foreground politics in all this, and that's in this passage that I've put up here. By privileging politics, we do not mean to suggest that race has been displaced as a concern of scientific inquiry, or for that matter, as a theological question. I remember in our earliest discussions of the history, we talked about the fact that one way of classifying people in Jewish and Christian thought, and actually in Muslim thought too, is in relation to theological questions. So the children of Israel are the children of Israel because when he becomes Israel, when he takes the name Israel, there's a covenant that goes back to the covenant with Moses and so on. There's an agreement which places the children of Israel, the descendants of Israel, in a special relation to God, and everybody else in a different relation to God. So that's an example of a theological account of identity that's from the past. And for contemporary religious people, since the Bible, the Christian Bible, which is authoritative for Jews and Christians and an important text for Muslims, suggests that every modern human being is a descendant of one of three men, namely the children of Noah, Ham, Shem, and Japheth. And again, figuring out who the Shemites, what we call them Semites, but the children of descendants of Shem, the Japhethites, and Hamites and so on, who they are was an interesting topic of debate in the 18th and early 19th century in this country, and continues, I suppose, to be an important question for anybody whose religious convictions require them to take the biblical account of human origins seriously. So I think that's why they mention this. Okay, by privileging politics, we don't mean to suggest that it isn't a subject of scientific or theological inquiry, nor do we claim that struggles over cultural representation are less significant than political ones in shaping prevailing patterns of race and racism. We do argue, however, that race is now a preeminently political phenomenon. So again, there are obviously struggles over the cultural representation of different racial groups. There's contests over stereotypes. The NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, has image awards, which he gives every year to television and programs and so on, because they think that they help undo negative stereotypes of Black people. And there are some LGBT groups that do the same for queer representation. So so that's, and that's a real struggle. It's a struggle over cultural representation. I suppose you could say that it was political in some sense, because it's in the end supposed to connect with issues about the treatment of people in social life, and that in the end is always going to connect with the state. But again, they're not denying that those are there. They're not saying that they're less important because they have less to do with the state. They're saying rather, as they say in the last sentence of this passage, race is now a preeminently political phenomenon. So that is, as sociologists, they're interested in the way these categories are used in everyday social life. And if by the social meaning of race you mean what significance it has in the lives of men and women in society, then clearly that significance today is indeed, to a high degree, the results of political struggles in the most central sense of politics, that is, having to do with the state and the law. So things like the Black Lives Matter movement recently, or the earlier civil rights movement, or the current opposition of the Trump administration to DEI programs, these are all struggles about what the government can do, what the state can do and not do. And this is what leads Omi and Wynand to say that race is a concept that signifies and symbolizes social conflicts and interests by referring to different types of human bodies. But I think the really key idea is not race, but their notion of racialization, the process by which questions about the allocation of power and resources come to be shaped having different kinds of bodies. Hello, am I? Somebody, Luke Alonso. Can you hear me?
Yeah, you cut out for a second, but I can hear you now.
Hello?
I can hear you. Can you hear us? Um, can any of you guys hear him? Anybody?
Hello?
I can, but I
Yeah,
don't
I
think
can hear you
he can
just
hear
fine
us.
Hello?
now.
Okay.
Yeah,
Can anybody hear me?
Maybe if we
I
type
can
in the
hear
chat.
everyone.
Okay.
I can hear everyone as well.
I think he's lagging a bit on his
I
end.
can
Yeah, he's
hear.
lagging on
Okay, I
his
think
end.
I'm back.
Can you hear us now?
Am I back?
Hello?
You're cutting out
Am
a
I
bit.
back?
You're back, but
You were
I've come
cutting out
back.
a
It says
lot.
my internet connection is unstable. Okay.
Yeah.
So did you hear me say
Um,
that the important thing is not race, but racialization?
yeah, that was like the last thing you said before you cut out.
Okay. Okay. So the key idea is not race, but racialization. And that's the process by which questions about the allocation of power. Okay, now it says that this is not visible. Shared thing. Somebody unmute and say hello.
Sorry, can you repeat that?
Can you see the shared screen?
I cannot sh see this shared screen.
I can see it. Your like
But I'm
stream froze a little
I'm
bit
going in and
and
out
keeps lagging.
of focus. Yes, I can
Yeah, but I
see.
can
I can
hear
see myself
you.
freezing.
Yeah, I can see it and hear you
Okay,
fine,
maybe
but
I'll
you're
turn off
lagging a bit.
my video. I'm going to turn off my video because should mean that the audio is more stable. And I'm hoping that that means you can still see the screen, shared screen. Can you see the shared screen still?
I can see it. I'm not sure if I'll be able to see movement or if it's frozen, but the
Okay.
audio is stable.
Okay, good. Thanks. Let me see. Now I have to be able to. Okay. If I shift, does that shift for you?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah,
Okay, good. Okay. All right. So they're going to define racialization as the extension of racial meaning to a previously racially unclassified relationship, social practice, or group. So I've suggested that racialization had already begun in the process by which, in Europe, by which the new Christians, Jewish and Muslim converts to Christianity after the so-called reconquest of Spain, were distinguished from other people in the Iberian Peninsula, both in Spain and in Portugal. Omi and Wynant deny this because they think that assignment of different statuses to different kinds of bodies was fundamentally religious in this period, as I said that Shakespeare and Marlowe's understanding of Othello and Barabbas was fundamentally religious in the Renaissance. I'm not sure that there's a real disagreement here. They agree that these religious categorizations helped pave the way for racial ideas because, again, they paved the way for the idea that whatever people's outward performances, whether or not the new Christians were, going to mass and crossing themselves and doing all the things that good Catholics were supposed to do, there was a truth about them underneath all those appearances, which was that they were fundamentally Muslim or Jewish still. And that idea that there's something inside, as it were, that is at the heart of difference between groups gets transferred into the racial system, and one consequence of that is that eventually Jews are racialized. So anyway, the point is we don't need to argue about the significance. Everybody agrees that this development of the idea of there's something underlying the new Christians, for which, by the way, the Spanish word was raza. So they did use the Spanish word that we would translate as race. Everybody agrees that that was an important part of the history. They agree with me that these religious categorizations helped pave the way for the racial ideas, and we can certainly agree with them that there's a significant shift when you move from these fundamentally religious discussions to the proto-scientific discussions. But in any case, it's because these early systems of classification are fundamentally religious that they claim that the first time racialization really occurs is with the bodies of Africans in the transatlantic slave trade and of the people who were in the Americas before European conquest and colonization, the indigenous people whom Europeans called Indians. More importantly, recall the passage I just cited about why they focus on politics. The ways in which white people came to dominate people of color in the Americas do seem a more important antecedent to the current racial situation in the United States than those religious discussions in Spain after the Reconquest, which is the natural focus of their concerns as sociologists of the contemporary United States. So if you focus on politics, then one thing, though not the only thing, you will focus on is the state, the government. There are many other institutions in a society other than the government, of course. There are families. The family is an institution or a set of institutions. There are businesses, corporations, and LLCs, smaller companies, various sorts. There are churches and temples and synagogues, religious organizations. There are lots of non-governmental organizations, the National Rifle Association or the American Civil Liberties Union. And there are clubs as well. There are fan clubs for sports teams. There are clubs, there are shooting clubs, there are riding clubs, all kinds of clubs. These are all the ones apart from the government. All of these we can call civil society, though sometimes people use that phrase to mean everything except government and corporations. But for our purposes, I think the idea of institutions that are not state institutions is the key one, so I'm going to keep corporations as part of civil society. Notice that civil society is shaped by the state. Corporations are incorporated under law. Churches are registered as charities, and so on. Clubs can be registered with the Attorney General so that they get special tax treatment and so on. So all of these institutions typically relate to the state through the law, through being registered in various ways. And in the case of corporations, once they're registered, they're governed by a vast network of law, but nevertheless is designed to make it possible for them to do something like, in the case of Amazon, sell you almost anything you might want. So Omi and Winant say that our notion of a racial formation foregrounds the ongoing political contestation that takes place between the state and civil society across the political spectrum to define and redefine the very meaning of race. And they give the, I think, very good example of the census definitions of race as a place where the government takes one position and uses it to define its policies, for example, its non-discrimination policies. But those categories used in the census can be contested in society. So a nice example of this is the famous 1977 Directive number 15 of the Office of Management and Budget that's still used today as a basis for government bodies like the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, the CDC, to explain their use of racial terms. Now, this directive defines Black as referring to people who have their, quote, origins in any of the Black racial groups of Africa. But as Omi and Winant point out, it does not define a white person with reference to any of the white racial groups of Europe, North Africa, or the Middle East. Indeed, Black is the only category that's defined in this document with an explicit racial designator, one which is quite problematic. What, you might ask, are the Black racial groups of Africa? Then there are Hispanics who are defined in this thing, which the government says are not a racial group, but an ethnic group, the only ethnic group about which the United States government systematically collects data, because it thinks of white not as an ethnic group, but as a racial group. Has that category defined? The category Hispanic is defined through a combination of national ethnic designator, a person of Mexican, Puerto Rican, Cuban, Central or South American or other Spanish culture or religion, and in this definition, Hispanics can be of any race. The category of American Indian or Alaskan Native complicates matters even further. To be counted as part of the group, individuals must not only trace their origins in any of the original peoples of North America, but they must also maintain, quote, cultural identification through tribal affiliation or community recognition. Now, the fact that the government's racial categories are quite diverse might seem to confirm the idea that they're produced through processes of racial formation that have a variety of aims. The black-white distinction clearly has to do with the heritage of slavery and Jim Crow. The American Indian category reflects the history of expulsion, genocide, and incorporation by treaty that affected different American Indian groups differently and produced a complex system of tribal recognition carried out by a body called the Federal Bureau of Indian Affairs. And the category Hispanic reflects the varieties of ways in which Spanish-speaking people, especially from Latin America and the Caribbean, have been incorporated into the United States, including, of course, those in the Southwest who became Americans when parts of northern Mexico, as it then was, were annexed by the United States. These are the people who, as they say, became citizens of the United States, not because their ancestors crossed the border, but because the border crossed them. So many Hispanics, Latinos in the Southwest are people whose ancestors were Mexican before that part of when that part of the country was northern Mexico. And now it's part of the United States. They became American when they didn't cross any border. They became American because the United States incorporated parts of northern Mexico. Now, here's the point. Not only is politics central to all these very different processes, the different processes by which these different groups came to be part of our population, the categories are contested by non-governmental organizations and by individuals. So take the category Hispanic, which some people, despite the government, regard as a racial category. After all, the Latino-Latina organization on many campuses is called La Raza. So according to the US Census Bureau, over the last four censuses, over the four censuses, this is a quote, but there have been more censuses since then. According to the US Census Bureau, over the last four censuses, so the censuses from 1980, 1990, 2000, 2010, at least 40% of Hispanics failed to answer either the race question and/or the ethnicity question. Correspondingly, some 95% of individuals who mark the some other race box were classified Hispanic by the census. So some people that the government classifies as Hispanic don't recognize the racial categories and ethnic categories of the census and reject the category Hispanic itself. They don't identify themselves as Hispanic. All right, with this in mind, we can return to the definition of racial formation itself. Omi and Wynand see the process by which racial identities are created as the interactive result of many people doing different and contesting things whose effect is to shape the social meaning of racial categories. And they call all these various activities aimed at affecting the social meaning of racial categories, they call all these activities racial projects. And they say a racial project is simultaneously an interpretation, representation, or explanation of racial identities and meanings, and at the same time, an effort to organize and distribute resources along particular cultural or racial lines. And they go on to give a couple of examples, since that's rather abstract. So, here's an example. The cop who stops and frisks a young pedestrian, the student who joins the memorial march for the slain teenager Trayvon Martin, even the decision to wear dreadlocks These can all be understood as racial projects. All right, so they can now summarize the central aims of their theory. The theory of racial formation suggests that society is suffused with racial projects, large and small, to which all are subjected, where that means they have an effect on all of us. And the notion of a racial project allows them to define two particular kinds of projects that I'll note now, because they'll be important later when we come to thinking more explicitly about racism. Here's something they say. A racial project can be defined as racist if it creates or reproduces structures of domination based on racial significations and identities. Continuing the argument, they say a bit later, advanced throughout this chapter, we define anti-racist projects as those that undo or resist structures of domination based on racial significations and identities. All right, that is the heart, I think, of their theory, including their account of racism and what it is to be anti-racist. I'll just pause for a moment. I want to say something about Fagin and Elias, but the other reading. But if you have thoughts about what I've been saying so far, just as I say, pop a hand up or just speak up. Does anyone have anything to say? Is it Rami? How do you say your name?
Yes, it's really.
Rami, hi.
Sorry, this might be moving backwards a little bit, but
That's fine.
back to the question of like the master category.
Mhm.
Maybe, and I'm sorry if you mentioned this already. I know we went over like the intersectionality theory. My understanding was like that intersectionality theory was like emphasizes how race or like class, gender, and sexuality, they're mutually like kind of effective, and I think I'm having trouble understanding like race as a master category. Um, if they're trying to say that is almost more, I don't know if that like foundational.
Yes, right. So their claim is that it plays a special role in the system of categories. Of course, it follows from intersectionality, which is not their concept, but it follows from the facts of intersectionality that gender inflects race, class inflects race, religion inflects race. So race is affected by other categories, and other categories are, they say, shaped by race as well, in the ways we've sort of talked about with gender being inflected by race because the place of women in the labor market depends not just on their gender, but also on their race and class. And the other example you'll recall is the way in which our class categories are racially inflected. So part of the reason redneck was used as an insult was that it was basically addressed to white people who did jobs that black people were supposed to do, roughly, right? And that was part of the character of their class situation, was that they were doing something in the labor market, in the labor system, that they weren't supposed to be doing because they were white. So these are examples of the ways in which a category like class, which you might think is a self-standing category, turns out in a system like the one we have in the United States to be shaped by race. You can't explain why it was meant to be insulting to call people rednecks if you don't understand that it was because they were doing something. It wasn't just because they were working with their hands. It was because they were working with their hands in a way that black people were supposed to, and black people were dishonored. And so they sort of inherited the dishonor by doing the work of black people. So I'm not sure that I'm not sure they say clearly enough, and this is what you're, I suspect, detecting, what they mean by a master category. They give examples, but they don't sort of, as it were, give a theory of what it is for something to be a master category. And so we could retreat to a slightly less theoretical sounding claim, which is just that racial categorization, racial formation plays a role in the United States, which means that whatever other identities you have, your racial identity is going to affect your social treatment. And that seems plausible. But of course, that claim is true about gender as well. That is, whatever other properties you have in the United States, your gender is going to affect how you're socially treated. So that doesn't distinguish race and gender, right? And it may well, and class, I think, is the same. I mean, I think we in this country don't talk a lot about class, but and a lot of, I mean, almost, if you ask Americans, most of them say they're middle class. And if that were true, it wouldn't be a very useful category. Hardly any Americans, including some very powerful ones, would identify as upper class. Do you know any? Have you ever met an American who said, "Yes, I'm upper class"? I don't. You probably haven't. I certainly haven't. But we might identify certain people as part of a ruling class. We might say, you know, the Kennedys are part of a ruling class or something. But we don't talk about class very much. But nevertheless, if you have a notion of class as having to do with a combination of how much money you have, how much education you have, you and your family have, and how much, how good your social connections are. And so we call that financial capital, cultural capital, and social capital. If you think of it as a matter of what kinds of social capital, cultural capital, and financial capital you have, then you can classify people in the United States in such a way that many people are low on all three, social, financial, cultural. Many people are high on all three. And then there are all kinds of people in between. Graduate students in the humanities are typically low on financial capital, but high on cultural capital. And if they teach at an elite university, they're acquiring a lot of social capital, and so on. So if you have a system of class that's sort of based on those ideas, then it seems to me it is true that that system in the United States is very much shaped by race and gender, the class system, and that race and gender are very much shaped by class. You remember I mentioned that 50% of African Americans report a negative interaction with the police, and it's 3 or 4% for white people. But in the other 50% are going to be lots of upper class black people or upper middle class black people who've never had a bad interaction with the police. Though a black person can have a bad interaction with the police on the basis of their race, even if they are upper class, right? So Henry Louis Gates Jr. was arrested in his own house by a white cop, and he's rich, and he's a Harvard professor, and he has honorary degrees from Cambridge and Yale and everywhere, and a PhD from Harvard, from Cambridge University in England. So he has all the indices of high class, but his race got him into trouble with a cop. So I think the key sort of intersectionality inside is that it's hard to predict what the effects of your gender will be without knowing what your race and class are. And it's hard to predict what the effects of your race will be without knowing your class and gender. And it's hard to know what the effects of your class will be without knowing your race and gender. So if you're resisting the thought that it's obvious that race is kind of more like that than the others, I agree that they need to say more to establish that claim.
Thank you.
Okay, good. Other thoughts about this before I go on to talk about, what time is it? We got 10 minutes. Talk about Fagin and Elias. Okay, Luke is saying no, so I'm going to proceed. I mean, he's not saying no, he's shaking his head. All right. It's one of the disadvantages of having a name ending in A that I get to see you rather than anybody else. I know that experience since I have a name ending in A. I'm beginning with A. All right. Now, the paper by Fagin and Elias, I think, provides a useful summary, if some perhaps arguably a little bit tendentious summary of actually, now let's do the discussion thing that I put up. Maybe it would be at least helpful if you offered some sense of what you think are racial projects. So remember the examples of racial projects. One was a stop and frisk, and another was wearing dreadlocks. What other things can you think of that might count as racial projects on their account of racial projects?
DEI initiatives.
Great. So DEI initiatives and anti-DEI initiatives are both racial projects. Good. And remember, racial projects can be done by individuals or by institutions, and DEI is a good example of an institutional racial project.
Maybe like recidivism rates for prison.
Right. So I think they would say that those are the result of racial projects, some of them at least.
Okay.
I mean, that is the patterns, so recidivism, just in case everybody doesn't know the word, recidivism means rates are the rates at which people who've been incarcerated return to prison. And those are shaped by race, and it's presumably many people think because of the racial projects of the prison system or of the parole system or of the sentencing system or of the police and the prosecutorial system that's true. That's what you meant, I imagine.
Yeah.
Yeah, good. Great. All right. So now, if something like recidivism rates is a good example of the working of racial projects or the interaction of racial projects to produce a result, then it does seem right to say that that our society is suffused with racial projects. Lots and lots of things that happen because of people having racial projects, including simply the project of living out a racial identity. So some people who are landlords don't want to rent their the homes they own to people of some racial groups. That's illegal, at least if they own more than a few of them. It's probably not illegal if you're renting a room in your own home to have racial preferences, but it is illegal if you're just running a business. That's a racial project. That they can carry out that racial project depends in part on the fact that when somebody calls you on the telephone, you can often tell what racial group they belong to by the way they speak. That is a result of a racial project of theirs. namely the project of protecting a racial identity through the way you speak. And that may not be a super conscious racial project, but it remains the case that it's something that people do. That is, it's under your control whether you sound one way or another. You could learn to sound a different way. And so the fact that you sound the way you do is in some sense under your control, especially if you grew up in a place where there's a variety of ways of speaking. You can sort of tap into any of the ones that are around you. So the racial project of identifying as a Black person through your speech, or identifying as a, I mean, of course, there are some Americans who are white, who identify as white, who sound Black because they grew up, for example, in Black communities, or because they identify, because of their musical tastes, with Black forms of speech and so on. And so their decision to speak the way they do, as I say, it's not exactly conscious, but it's under your control. That decision is itself a racial project. It's because a white person who sounds Black is doing something in the domain of racial meanings. All right. I've only got 3 minutes left, so I think we're pretty much caught up. I'm going to go, I'm not going to say a huge amount of Fagin and Elias, but I will say a bit, but I'll say it at the beginning on Wednesday before turning to the next discussion, which is a discussion of social construction. So in the 3 minutes available, perhaps you would like some of you to ask a question or raise an issue, or say something about this discussion page that is up on the screen right now. Something going on in the chat. What is this? Anybody have anything to say, or are we just going to abandon each other? Okay, well, if you've got nothing you particularly want to say, I will start with Fagin and Elias. There they are on Wednesday, and we can, and then we'll be catching up a bit because I suspect that won't take me more than 20 minutes, and then we can talk about social construction and Haslanger. We should be meeting in the classroom on Wednesday, which I would much prefer, but it is going to snow on Wednesday again, apparently. So look out for messages from the system about what to expect, because as I say, it's conceivable that who knows what's going to happen. Anyway, in the meanwhile, bye-bye, everybody, and see you next time.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you.